There are moments in life that divide everything into a before and an after. For me, that moment happened in the cold, flickering light of a New York hospital hallway. I was standing there, holding a small yellow baby blanket I had spent 3 months knitting, when my son Gavin looked at me with unfamiliar eyes and said, "Dad, Olivia only wants her immediate family in the room. Please don't make this difficult." Those words didn't feel like a shout. They felt like a quiet, sharp blade. I looked at Gavin, the boy I had raised alone for 15 years, and saw only a stranger wearing the face of my son. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. I stood there, my boots damp from the February snow, having just spent 12 hours on a cheap bus from Nashville. 12 hours of staring at headlights on the highway, imagining the moment I would hold my first grandson. I had pictured his tiny fingers wrapping around my hand, the proud smile on Gavin's face, and maybe even a nod of acceptance from his wife, Olivia. I had imagined a family. Instead, I was a nuisance to be managed and escorted out of the building. My name is Lawrence Miller, and I am 63 years old. I spent 4 decades of my life in Nashville, Tennessee, living in a modest house with a porch that always needed painting. For most of my life, I worked at a local hardware store, helping neighbors pick out the right nails, lumber, and tools. It was a simple life, but it was mine. I married Margaret when I was 26. She was a quiet woman with a laugh that could clear any dark cloud. We had Gavin when I was 33. From the second the doctor handed him to me, my entire world shifted. I swore I would give him everything I never had. But life has a way of tearing down the plans you build. When Gavin was 15, Margaret had a sudden stroke and died. She went quietly like a candle blowing out in an empty room. In a single day, my family of 3 became 2. The medical bills and funeral costs were overwhelming. I had to sell my share of the hardware store just to keep our house, and I was left with nothing but a mountain of debt. From that day on, I had one goal: to make sure Gavin went to a good college and had a career that didn't involve aching joints and calloused hands. I took 2 jobs to make it happen. The first started at 5 a.m. at a local medical clinic. I mopped floors, scrubbed toilets, and emptied trash cans, the smell of bleach burning my nose. At 2 p.m., I would change my clothes and walk to a veterinary clinic where I worked the reception desk until 8 p.m. My hands grew rough and my back was a constant dull ache, but every single dollar I earned went straight into Gavin's college fund. I didn't care about the pain. When Gavin got accepted into the civil engineering program at the University of Chicago, it felt like we had won a war. We sat at the kitchen table, looking at the acceptance letter, and Gavin hugged me. He said, "I'm going to build bridges, Dad, and I'll name the first one after you." I laughed and told him to name it after his mother instead. Gavin worked hard. During his college years, I kept working my 2 shifts, sending him money for rent, books, and groceries. When he graduated at 22, I stood in the crowd, wearing a suit that was 10 years old, and cried. I was so proud. I thought of Margaret and felt I had fulfilled my promise to her. 2 months later, Gavin got a job offer from a major construction firm in New York City. The starting salary was $75,000, more money than I had ever made in a single year. I helped him pay the security deposit for his apartment and bought him 3 nice suits for work, draining the last of my savings. I didn't hesitate. He was my son, and his success was my reward. When he first moved, we talked every Sunday night. He would tell me about the tall buildings, the fast pace of the city, and how much he missed the quiet streets of Nashville. But slowly, the city began to change him. The calls went from every Sunday to every 2 weeks, and then to a quick text once a month. "Busy with work, Dad. Talk next week." I told myself this was normal. Young men need to build their own lives, and a father shouldn't hang on to their sleeves. My best friend Bruce Henderson told me I was being too soft. Bruce would sit on my porch, drinking sweet tea, and say, "Larry, you gave that boy everything. A text once a month is a slap in the face." I defended Gavin, saying he was under pressure. But deep down, the empty house felt heavier with every passing week. Then, about 2 years ago, Gavin called with a different tone in his voice. He had met a woman named Olivia Bennett. She was an architect from a prominent New York family. Her father was a wealthy real estate developer, and her mother, Eleanor, was a retired college professor. From the way Gavin spoke about her, I could tell he was infatuated, but I also noticed how he started to sound self-conscious about his own background. He began asking me about our family history, whether we had any relatives with prestigious degrees or property. I told him the truth. We were farmers and laborers. That was the first time I felt a cold draft between us. When they got engaged, Gavin didn't call to tell me. He sent an email with the digital invitation. It was a formal beige card that read, "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett request the honor of your presence at the marriage of Olivia Bennett to Gavin Miller." There was no note from my son, just a link to a registry where the cheapest item was a silver gravy boat worth $200. I bought the gravy boat, even though it cost me a week's worth of groceries, and bought a ticket to New York. I believed that once I was there, the distance between us would vanish. I believed Gavin would look at me and remember the father who had scrubbed floors so he could wear a suit. But when I arrived at the venue, a lush garden in Long Island, I realized how wrong I was. The wedge in the wedding humiliation. As I walked into the Long Island garden, I saw Gavin standing in the center of a group of people in expensive attire. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but as I walked toward him, his smile faltered. He stepped away from his friends and met me halfway, his eyes darting around the garden as if he was afraid someone would see us together. "Dad, you're here," he said, giving me a quick, formal hug. Before I could answer, he added, "Look, things are pretty hectic right now. Olivia's family is very particular about how things are run. I've arranged for you to sit with some of my work colleagues in the third row. Just try to blend in, okay?" He didn't ask how my 12-hour bus trip was or if I had eaten. He just patted my shoulder and walked back to his new friends, leaving me standing alone in the crowd. I found my seat in the third row. The front 2 rows were reserved for Olivia's family. I sat between 2 of Gavin's coworkers who paid no attention to me, talking instead about New York real estate and stock options. A few minutes later, Gavin brought Olivia over to introduce her. She looked stunning in her designer gown, but as she looked at me, her eyes did a quick sweep from my worn leather shoes to my haircut. I saw the subtle shift in her expression, a silent judgment that said I didn't belong in her world. "It's nice to finally meet you, Lawrence," she said, offering a hand that felt as cold as ice. "Gavin has told me about Nashville." Before I could say a word of congratulations, she turned to address a waiter and walked away. Then came Eleanor Bennett, Olivia's mother. She was a tall, elegant woman who carried herself with an air of absolute authority. When Gavin introduced us, she gave me a tight, practiced smile. "Ah, the father from Tennessee," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Gavin is a bright young man, Lawrence. We've been helping him refine his taste. New York is quite a step up from Nashville, isn't it?" I nodded, swallowing the anger in my throat. I wanted to tell her that the bright young man she was refining was built on 15 years of my sweat and calloused hands, but I held my tongue. Margaret always told me that silence is dignity, so I just smiled and said, "Gavin is a good boy." Eleanor patted her pearls and walked away, murmuring something about checking on the catering. The ceremony was beautiful, but to me, it felt like watching a play from the back of a theater. I watched my son exchange vows with a woman I didn't know, in front of a crowd of strangers who looked at me like an intruder. At the reception, my table was near the kitchen doors. I sat listening to the constant clatter of dishes and the hurried whispers of waitstaff while the rest of the guests drank expensive champagne. During the toasts, Olivia's father stood up and spoke about expanding their family's legacy and how proud he was to welcome Gavin into their circle. When Gavin stood up to speak, he thanked Olivia's parents for throwing such a magnificent wedding, calling them his new guides in life. He didn't mention me, not once. He didn't mention Nashville, or his mother, or the sacrifices that had brought him to that room. I sat in the corner, staring at my plate, feeling my heart crack. The day after the wedding, I took the 12-hour bus back to Nashville. The ride felt twice as long as the trip to New York. The empty house welcomed me with a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat at my kitchen table, made a cup of black coffee, and stared at the digital invitations still pinned to my refrigerator. I told myself it was just wedding stress, that once they settled down, things would go back to normal. But they didn't. After their 1-week honeymoon in Cancun, which I only knew about through Olivia's public social media posts, the calls became even scarcer. Gavin called once every 3 weeks, and the conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. "How are you, Dad?" "I'm fine, Gavin. How is the new apartment? Great. Olivia is redecorating. She bought some Italian furniture. Look, I have to go. Olivia is waiting for me. We're going to a gallery opening. And the line would go dead. I tried to keep busy. Bruce Henderson kept coming over, trying to drag me out of the house. We would go fishing at the local lake, but my mind was always in New York. One Saturday, as we sat in his boat, Bruce looked at me and said, "Larry, you're ghosting yourself. You're sitting by the phone like a teenager waiting for a prom date. That boy has chosen his sides. He's running with the big dogs now, and he thinks you're just a stray." "He's busy, Bruce," I replied, staring at my fishing line. "He's trying to make a life." "There's a difference between making a life and erasing the man who gave you one," Bruce said, spit-shining a lure. "You need to wake up." But I couldn't. I kept making excuses. On my 62nd birthday, Gavin didn't call. Instead, I received a package in the mail containing a $100 gift card to a chain restaurant and a printed card that said, "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you have a good day. Gavin and Olivia." I didn't use the card. I put it in a drawer and spent the evening sitting on my porch, watching the sunset over the trees, wondering when the boy who used to bake cookies with me had vanished. I tried to tell myself that I was being too sensitive, that this was what success looked like. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was being slowly, systematically erased from my son's life. Olivia wanted a husband with a clean, pedigree background, and a retired hardware store worker from Nashville didn't fit the blueprint. Gavin, eager to please her and her wealthy family, was more than willing to hold the eraser. The birth of Wyatt and the 5-minute hold then. One Tuesday night, Gavin called with news that took my breath away. Olivia was pregnant. The world around me seemed to stop. "I'm going to be a father, Dad," Gavin said, his voice carrying a trace of the warm boy I used to know. I was finally going to be a grandfather. I asked how far along she was, and he told me 3 months. They had waited until the first trimester passed because of risks. Deep down, I knew Olivia's parents had probably known from day one, but I didn't care. I was just happy. I started knitting a yellow baby blanket immediately. I sent the blanket to New York with a card. 2 weeks later, Gavin sent a text, "Got the blanket, Dad. Thanks." There was no photo of Olivia holding it. No call, just a short message. I texted Olivia but got no reply. Gavin said she was too exhausted to talk. There was always an excuse. Wyatt was born on a freezing Thursday in February. I didn't get a call, a text, or an email. I found out through Facebook. I was mopping the final examination room at the medical clinic when my phone buzzed. It was a notification. I opened it and saw a photo of a newborn boy wrapped in a white hospital blanket, his tiny fists clenched. The caption read, "The love of our lives has arrived. Welcome, Wyatt Miller. Mom and baby are healthy." I froze in the middle of the room, still clutching the mop as tears streamed down my face. I sat on the wet floor, my cleaning gloves still on, and sobbed. A coworker walked in, saw me on the floor, and asked what was wrong. I showed her the phone and whispered, "My grandson was born. This is the first time I'm seeing his face, and it's on Facebook." She took the mop from my hands, helped me up, and told me to go home. I sat in my kitchen, waiting. By 8 p.m. I called him. It took 6 rings before he answered, his voice tired. "I saw the picture, Gavin. Congratulations," I said. "Oh, thanks, Dad," he replied. "Why didn't you call me, Gavin?" "I had to find out on Facebook. I'm sorry, Dad. Everything happened so fast. Olivia went into labor early, and we had to rush. I was exhausted. You had time to post online, but not call me?" My voice cracked with pain. "Dad, please don't start," he sighed. "We just had a baby. Can you just this once not make things more difficult?" "Difficult? Gavin, I'm his grandfather." "I know, but Olivia needs space. She only wants her close family around right now." "I am close family, Gavin. You know what I mean, Dad. Just give us some time. I'll let you know when you can visit." 3 weeks later, Gavin finally sent a message. "You can come this weekend, but just for 1 day. Olivia is still recovering and doesn't want visitors at the apartment." It was a limitation, a boundary, but I didn't care. I booked a night bus immediately, a 12-hour ride each way. I packed a small bag, wearing my neatest slacks and a clean ironed shirt. I wanted to look respectable, like a grandfather they could be proud of. I arrived in New York on Saturday morning, changed in a terminal restroom, and met them at the hospital where Wyatt had a pediatric checkup. When I walked into the waiting room, I saw Olivia holding a bundle, with Gavin sitting beside her. I walked over, my heart pounding. Gavin stood up and gave me a brief, awkward nod. Olivia looked up, gave her usual tight smile, and said, "Hello, Lawrence. You made it." "Yes," I said, looking at the bundle. "Can I hold him, Olivia?" She pulled the blanket tighter around the baby. He just fell asleep. "If we move him, he'll wake up and fuss. The doctor is going to call us in a minute anyway." I swallowed my disappointment and sat down. For 20 minutes I sat in silence. Gavin stared at his phone. Olivia stared at the wall. I stared at the bundle, trying to catch a glimpse of my grandson's face. When the doctor called their name, they both stood up and walked into the office, leaving me in the waiting room. When they came out 45 minutes later, I stood up, hoping we could go to their apartment so I could spend time with Wyatt. But Olivia shook her head. "Actually, Lawrence, I'm really tired. We're just going to grab a quick bite at the cafe next door, and then we need to go home. My mother and sister are coming over this afternoon." "I can come to the apartment too," I said. "I'd love to meet them, and I won't be in the way." "It's a very small space, Lawrence," Olivia said, her voice sharp. "It wouldn't be comfortable for you. It's best if you head back." I looked at Gavin, waiting for him to speak, to defend his father, who had traveled 12 hours just to see his child. Gavin looked down at his shoes, put a hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "Dad, please don't make this harder." We went to the cafe. I ordered a sandwich I couldn't swallow. Olivia fed Wyatt under a cover blocking my view. Gavin talked about work, his voice nervous and rushed. An hour later, Gavin checked his watch. "We should get a cab for you, Dad. Your bus leaves in 2 hours." When the cab arrived, Olivia hesitantly handed me Wyatt. "Just a minute, Lawrence." I took Wyatt in my arms. He was so soft and warm, smelling of milk. He opened his tiny eyes and his little fingers wrapped around my thumb. Tears rose in my eyes, but I forced them back. "Hello, Wyatt," I whispered. "I'm your grandpa. 5 minutes." That was all I got. 5 minutes in the back of a New York cab before Olivia took him back. Gavin shut the cab door, saying, "Thanks for understanding, Dad. Safe travels." During the 12-hour ride back to Nashville, I pulled out my phone and checked Facebook. Olivia had already posted a photo of them at the cafe. It was a picture of Gavin, Olivia, and baby Wyatt, smiling warmly. The caption read, "A perfect morning with the ones I love." I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't mentioned. It was as if I had never existed, and right there, on that dark bus, I finally realized the truth. I was not family. I was just an inconvenience. The $10,000 bill and the forgery discovery. When I returned to Nashville, the silence of my house was no longer comforting. It was heavy with the weight of my own foolishness. I had spent 15 years cleaning floors and veterinary tables, trading my health for my son's future, and he had traded me for a seat in a Long Island garden and a family that looked at me like a stain on their pedigree. I decided then that I was done. I would no longer chase after a relationship where I had to beg for a scrap of affection. I went back to my shifts, spent my evenings reading old books, and turned my phone off at 9 p.m. every night. I was trying to rebuild my peace, block by block, in the quiet of my kitchen. 3 weeks after my trip to New York, the phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. A woman's voice, polite but businesslike, came through the line. "Is this Mr. Lawrence Miller?" "Yes, this is Lawrence," I said. "I'm calling from the billing department at St. Mary's Hospital in New York. We're calling regarding the outstanding balance for Olivia Bennett's delivery room and postnatal services. The remaining balance after insurance is $10,000. Your son, Gavin Miller, listed you as the primary financial guarantor and emergency contact." My blood ran cold. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands trembling. Gavin hadn't called me when my grandson was born. He had hidden the pregnancy. He had given me 5 minutes to hold the child in the back of a taxi. But he had given the hospital my phone number and social security information, which he had memorized from my tax documents years ago, to pay a $10,000 bill. "Mr. Miller, are you there?" the woman asked. "We need to process the payment to avoid legal action and collections against you." I took a deep breath. For my entire life I had said yes to Gavin. I had sold Margaret's store. I had mopped floors. I had emptied my savings. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. A quiet, clear strength returned to my chest. "You have the wrong number," I said, my voice steady and calm. Sir, we have your name and address on the guarantor form. I don't care what you have on the form, I replied. I don't have a son in New York. I don't have any family there. Do not call this number again. I hung up the phone and set it on the table. For the first time in 30 years, I had said no to my son and the sky didn't fall. But the betrayal ran deeper than a hospital bill. 2 days later, I received a certified letter in the mail from a high-interest private lender. It was a collections notice for a $25, zeros and personal loan that had defaulted. My name was on the document as the primary cosigner. I opened the attached paperwork and looked at the signature page. There, in shaky, unfamiliar handwriting, was my name, Lawrence Miller. Gavin had forged my signature to secure a loan to pay for their luxury apartment lease and maintain the high-end lifestyle Olivia's family expected. He had used my identity, my clean credit, and my name as his personal shield, knowing I had no money to fight back. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my chest aching. The next morning, I walked down to the local legal aid clinic in Nashville. An attorney named Sarah looked over the documents and shook her head. This is clear forgery, Lawrence. Since the loan was executed in New York, we need to file an official report. Under her guidance, I drafted a certified letter to the lender and the credit bureaus. I invoked New York Penal Law Section 170.05 regarding third-degree forgery, declaring the contract void ab initio, null and void from the very beginning due to fraud and lack of mutual assent. I also filed a formal report under New York Social Services Law, Section 473, for elder financial exploitation. It was a hard step. It meant Gavin would face legal consequences and his credit would be ruined. But I had to protect my own survival. I was a retired man living on a modest pension. A $25,000 debt would destroy me. When the hospital and the lender contacted Gavin, the storm hit. I turned on my phone one evening to find 27 missed calls from him and 15 text messages. The messages started as urgent, then turned desperate, and finally angry. Dad, what did you do? The hospital said you denied knowing me. They're threatening collections. Dad, the lender called. They said you filed a forgery report. Are you trying to ruin my life? I can't believe you're doing this when we need you most. Olivia is crying. You're always so selfish. You've always tried to control me with money. Olivia was right about you from the start. Then came a long email from Gavin, accusing me of abandoning him and violating his mother's memory. Dad always said family helps each other, he wrote, confusing his father's words with mine. You're playing the victim because you didn't get your way at the wedding. Now our credit is at risk, and we might lose our apartment. Think about Wyatt. I read the email 3 times, the words stinging like salt in a wound. But I refused to let the guilt take hold. I opened the reply box and typed a response, keeping my words short and precise. Gavin. Your mother did believe in family, but she also believed in respect. I asked to be part of your life. I asked to hold my grandson. You gave me 2 hours and 5 minutes, then sent me away like a nuisance. You only remembered my name when the bill arrived, and you forged my signature to fund a life you couldn't afford. I will not pay the hospital, and I have filed the fraud reports to clear my name. I hope you and Olivia find a solution, but not at the cost of my dignity. If you ever want a real relationship with me, one based on respect, I will be here. Until then, I wish you both the best. Gavin's reply was instant. I can't believe how selfish you are. Olivia was right about you. Goodbye. I closed my laptop and felt a strange, quiet peace. The silence in my house was no longer lonely. It was the sound of my self-respect returning. The collapse and reconstruction, a 1.5 years of complete silence passed. I stopped checking Facebook. I stopped looking for photos of Wyatt. I slowly learned to live with the quietness in my house. I returned to my regular routine, joined a woodwork group at the community center, and went on long morning walks with Bruce Henderson. Little by little, I began to feel something resembling peace. It wasn't the ecstatic happiness of my youth, but it was steady, quiet, and mine. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, my phone rang. The screen displayed a New York area code. I hesitated, but I picked it up. Hello, is this Mr. Lawrence Miller? Yes, speaking, I said. My name is Elena Ruiz, and I'm a social worker from St. Mary's Hospital in New York. I'm calling regarding your grandson, Wyatt Miller. He is currently 1.5 years old. My chest tightened instantly. What happened? Is he okay? Wyatt is fine, but his mother, Olivia, was admitted to our psychiatric ward 2 days ago after a severe mental breakdown. Your son, Gavin, is at the hospital, but he is unable to care for the child under the circumstances. The family has faced severe financial difficulties. Gavin lost his job 6 months ago, and they were forced to move in with Olivia's parents. The living situation was highly tense, and it seems Olivia's family has cut them off. We need a family member to take temporary custody of Wyatt. Otherwise, we will have to contact Child Protective Services. Gavin listed you as the backup emergency contact. Backup contact. Even in his absolute ruin, I was still the second choice. Would you like me to transfer you to your son? The social worker asked. No, I replied, my voice steady. Just tell me where to go. I will come for Wyatt. I took the night bus to New York. The 12-hour ride was different this time. I wasn't traveling with a heart full of desperate hope, begging for a scrap of affection. I was traveling to rescue a child who had no part in his parents' pride and cruelty. When I arrived at the hospital, dawn was breaking. I walked into the waiting room and saw Gavin sitting on a plastic chair. He looked defeated. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and he was staring blankly at the floor. When he saw me, he stood up, his mouth opening in surprise, and then he burst into tears. He tried to hug me, saying, "Dad, I'm so sorry. You were right. I was so blind." I didn't hug him back. I just placed a hand on his shoulder, keeping my boundary firm, and said, "Where is Wyatt?" We walked to the temporary care facility a few blocks away. When the social worker brought Wyatt out, he was holding a plastic toy truck. He looked up at me with large, curious eyes. I knelt on the floor, offering my hand. "Hi, Wyatt," I said softly. "I'm your grandpa." He stared at me for a long second, and then he walked over and let me pick him up. The warmth of his little body against my chest healed a wound I thought would bleed forever. I stayed in New York for 4 months. I rented a small, cheap one-bedroom apartment near the hospital, using my savings on my own terms. I took care of Wyatt every day while Gavin worked temporary construction shifts and spent his evenings visiting Olivia in the ward. I cooked, I cleaned, and I took Wyatt to the park, teaching him how to throw bread to the ducks. Gavin and I spoke every night, but the dynamic had shifted. He no longer talked down to me, and he didn't make excuses. He was a man who had hit rock bottom and realized that the flashy, wealthy world he had traded his father for had discarded him the moment he lost his job. When Olivia was discharged, she came to my apartment to pick up Wyatt. She was thinner, her face pale, and the snobbish air of superiority was completely gone. She sat at my kitchen table looking at the yellow blanket I had knitted, which was now worn and stained from Wyatt's daily use. She looked at me, and tears began to stream down her face. "I'm sorry, Lawrence," she whispered. "My mother, Eleanor, was always so cold. She demanded perfection, and she made me believe that anyone who wasn't part of our social circle was a threat to my family's future. I wanted to protect Wyatt, but in my fear I behaved exactly like her. I treated you like a stranger when you were the only one who actually cared." "It's in the past, Olivia," I said. "But we have to do things differently now. Family means respect. If you want me in Wyatt's life, you have to respect me." "I do," she said, nodding through her tears. "I really do." Gavin and Olivia slowly rebuilt their lives. They moved to a cheaper apartment in New Jersey, away from the influence of Olivia's mother. Gavin found a stable job at a smaller engineering firm, and Olivia continued her outpatient therapy. I returned to my house in Nashville, but I visited them once every 2 months. The visits were no longer restricted to 2 hours in a cafe. I stayed at their home, and I held Wyatt whenever I wanted. A few years have passed. Wyatt is now 4.5 years old. Last month I visited them for his preschool graduation. As I sat in the crowd, Wyatt spotted me, pointed his finger, and yelled, "Grandpa Larry!" He ran down the aisle and jumped into my arms. Gavin and Olivia watched from the front row, smiling with genuine warmth. Gavin walked over, shook my hand, and said, "Dad, the day you told the hospital you didn't have family here, it broke me, but it was the best thing you ever did. It woke me up." I am 65 years old now. I look at my old leather purse, and I keep 2 photos inside. One is of Gavin when he was 5, and the other is of Wyatt and me laughing in the park. My life is not perfect, but it is honest. If you are listening to my story, remember this. Setting boundaries is not selfish. Saying no to those who exploit you is not a violation of love. Walking away from family members who treat you like a burden is the only way to save your own dignity. Love doesn't mean enduring everything. Love also means respecting yourself.